Hi, we continue in Genesis 43 today as Jacob, or Israel as he was called in the previous scene, as you can see on the right side of the screen here, finally accepts Judah's offer to be accountable for Benjamin and allows them to take Benjamin and a present along with him down to Egypt. And as we see, and you can see on the right side of the screen in the space in between the the boxed chiasms, it happens all in one verse, less than one verse. They went down to Egypt and stood before Joseph's face. And that's important to keep in mind, I think, given the Exodus story, that it took 40 years to get from Egypt back to the Promised Land. And here in these chapters, Genesis 42 to 45, they go back and forth between Canaan and Egypt like they were just going down the street to the store. So there doesn't seem to be any problem with going down this trade route, the very route that the Ishmaelites took Joseph when they bought him from the brothers down there in the first place. But what we'll see in this scene is an extended 5-part chiasm. After these little ABA chiasms that we saw in the last video, now we have a more traditional ABCBA chiasm, highlighting that's close to the center of the story here. And it involves something we didn't see in the previous chiastic pattern that we'll look at in just a second, which is having them wait in this liminal space at the entrance of Joseph's house while we get to hear them discuss what's going on. And as we do, we'll see that my previous admonitions not to assume we know what Joseph's intentions are is all the more the case now, because if we assumed that the silver was put in their bags to have them look like they were thieves, which is what they assumed it was for, we'll find out today it's something else. But in chapter 44, we'll find out that Joseph's view is a whole other way. So either he's changing his views or he's pretending to have his views, but in any case, we are at risk if we try to assume we know what Joseph's thinking before we see it and hear what actually happens. And even then, we have to know whether he's performing or speaking the truth. So with all that in mind, let's go back and look at some of the preliminary elements of our section here. We've been following this chiastic parallel in the green box here between what you can see in the left bracketed part in chapter 42 and now in the wider section from 43 to 45. So we completed in the last two videos this section 43, 1 to 14, and now we're in this section, the arrival in Egypt, and next time we'll see the audience. And there are a number of other elements of this here. We won't look at these exactly now, except for this one here, the question of what God's role in this, and we'll see in verse 23 that it's Joseph's servant, house servant here, described in the New RSV as the steward, but in the literal Hebrew simply as the man of the house, who assumes a divine explanation for why the silver is in the bag, and we'll look at that a little more as we go. So let's go back to our shape of the story, and here's the chiastic unit for today. And you can see the A and the A prime parts match around the call to the men, or bring the men into the house, and they brought the men into the house. The men are to eat with me at noon, and Joseph's coming at noon, and they would eat there. So those are almost exactly parallel. Then in the B part, the men were afraid because of the silver. Do not be afraid, I received your silver. And in the middle is their statement here of why they think they're okay or not okay, and we'll see their explanation as we get there. So let's just jump right into our scene. So we see, as my note below has, the transition from father to brother from Canaan to Egypt is done in one verse. Again, not even a whole verse. So the men took the present, and they took double the money with them, as well as Benjamin. Then they went on their way down to Egypt and stood before Joseph, or literally stood before his face, as we can see. And as I've been noting throughout these videos, the New RSV almost always leaves out the many body parts we find in the Hebrew, especially eyes, face, hands, and feet, that I've tried to restore back to here, so we can indicate the embodied aspect of these stories. And yet it says they're standing before Joseph's face, but they're actually not standing before Joseph's face exactly. They're going to be standing at the doorway of his house, as we'll see, and Joseph will delegate to his apparently chief house servant here the exchange with them. But we see, perhaps from inside Joseph's perspective, that before they see Joseph, we don't have any sense that they see Joseph here. Joseph saw Benjamin. And that raises a whole series of issues. And my note below has simply on the verse the two parts of this, what I was just noting, that we'll see 16 to 25 today. So when Joseph saw, and we see the shifting perspective in my note below. First we see Joseph's perspective here, then we see the steward, or the man as he's described there, and then we'll see the men, the brothers, starting in verse 18. But it's interesting that he's described as seeing Benjamin here. We'll see down in verse 29, not in today's video, but in the next one, that he's described more fully as his brother and their brother, etc. And And that's the full extent of the issue. And not only that, but his mother's son, so that they're full brothers of Rachel. But all we see here is Benjamin. And he doesn't express Joseph's perspective. He sees his beloved little brother, any affection from him. And he apparently doesn't lose any emotional control here, as he will in the later scenes. So calmly here, he says literally to the one over his house. And we note with this use of house, the frequency of house as a key word in this section. You see how many times in this chiasm. And we didn't see house at all in chapter 42. We simply saw Israel and his brothers and his sons, Israel and his sons, gathered around, but we didn't actually see a physical place where they were. When they were in Egypt, we simply saw them before Joseph, apparently with a long line of pilgrims seeking to buy grain, but there was never anything personal about it. And now we see them in his house. And we know nothing about this house. It's certainly got to be an elite house. He's second in command of Pharaoh. So we can imagine it's a big house with all kinds of servants, and he would be dressed as an Egyptian official, and there's no reason to think they would recognize him any more now than they did earlier. But it's certainly a little more intimate, that he's taking them away from the crowd of pilgrims and having a private meeting with them. They might wonder why that is, of why they merit something with the second in command of the greatest empire around, but they don't seem to be curious about that. They're focused on their own responsibility. So he says to them, presumably out of the hearing of the brothers, and certainly in an Egyptian that they can't understand, although there are some linguistic issues in the text here that the text doesn't directly address. We will, though. Bring the men into the house. So that's the invitation into the house, although they won't be in the house right away. They are here, but they're only at the doorway still, as we'll find out. So bring them into the house and slaughter an animal and make ready, or literally from the Hebrew, udva'ach tavach, literally slaughter a slaughtering. I didn't translate it that way because that's particularly awkward in English, but the point is no specific animal is named. So slaughter an animal worthy of slaughter and make ready here, and the hiphil imperative, only here in Genesis, a rare form. For the men are to dine with me at noon, and dine is perhaps overly formal for the ordinary word for to eat. So they're to eat with me at noon. The with me is not separately stated. It's an inference from the grammatical form of the verb there. But it's not with us. It's apparently with me. There's going to be a private meal at noon. And don't know enough about Egyptian meal practice to know is that something like what we might think of as lunch, a midday meal. It is midday, but the second of 3 meals a day, we simply don't know what the sequence of eating was in that context. And so now, having delegated to the man, we hear him simply as the man. And each man is 3 times in the verse, again covered over by the NRSV. So you can see it on my translation on the right side. The man did as Joseph said, and the man brought the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were afraid. So man, men, and all throughout this, and highlighting the relationship of them as simply humans here, male humans, but not in terms of brothers and sons, as we saw in the previous chapter. So the man did as Joseph said and brought the men to Joseph's house, but not in the house. But as you can see in verse 19, they're speaking at the entrance of the house. That comes as a little bit of surprise. And the reason is the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house. And perhaps they're afraid if they walk in the door, they'll be dead or imprisoned or something. They have limited freedom here, although nobody made them come back to Egypt, and no one is making them stand at Joseph's house. And there are no guards or anybody threatening them. And as we'll see, it will not be a hostile environment. But they're certainly afraid it is a hostile environment, and we can see how they respond right here. As my note below has, they've been singled out from the presumably large number of people coming into Egypt to buy grain and assume the worst. And we hear it here. Now the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, presumably to each other, it is because of the money, or literally, it's on the word of the silver, replaced or returned in our sacks. And I try to highlight the common use of the word returned, all the returns, returning to Egypt, returning home, returning the silver in their bags that they gave, and now will be returned back to them. So much returning, we see returned down here. I've tried to translate that consistently. So returned in our sacks the first time, or literally in the beginning, barachila, and it's again in verse 20, a different take on the first time. returned our sacks the first time, that we have been brought in so that they may have an opportunity to fall on us. And I translated that very differently over here, that you can see. So I have that he may roll on us and fall on us. And that's very different than opportunity. But the root word here in the hit patel infinitive absolute only here in the Hebrew scripture, in its normal everyday form of qual, means to roll. So when it suggests assaulted and fallen upon, in other words, there's not something setting up one opportunity. There's two things being done. Perhaps we hear that as a hendiadys of two things that operate as one thing. In other words, beat and push or something like that, or two ways of coming upon us. But in any event, their view is that they're going to be taken captive or beaten up or somehow taken advantage of, to make slaves of us and take our donkeys. It's curious that the New RSV translates avirim, slaves, here, whereas it translates the same word as servants many other times. But it is slaves the whole time. I didn't turn it from servants to slaves on the right side, but that's what it is. So with that fear in mind, let's scroll down a little more and see what happens. So we here get inside their heads as they talk about that they're afraid they're about to be taken captive. So now they went up to the man, again, it's not steward here, literally the man of Joseph's house, and spoke to them at the entrance of the house, at the petach, the same place that the men, the people of Sodom, come to Lot in chapter 19, the same place that Sarah talks to the visitors in chapter 18. So liminal spaces there. In chapter 18, it was about the question of having a child, or from Sarah's perspective, whether she would have moisture like the Garden of Eden. In chapter 19, it was about whether the visitors would succeed in getting Sodom to, I'm sorry, not the visitors, the residents of Sodom would succeed in getting Lot to turn over the visitors, which they do not. So a life and death situation there, and a life coming situation in chapter 18. Here they believe it's a life and death situation, but as we'll discover, it's not, at least not right now. So they said to the person, "O my Lord," calling him Lord on behalf of Joseph, "we came down the first time to buy food." And notice how many times the story is being told. I won't compare all of them here, but how many times are they telling it, and how many times are different people hearing it, whether that's Joseph, his servant, or Jacob and their father. "And we came to the lodging place," that we noted back in chapter 27, more like a caravanserai. "We opened our sacks, and behold," Gehenna, almost never translated as behold from the NORSV, "there was in each one's silver in the mouth of their sack." And that's exactly what we saw happen. So this is an accurate report. He adds our money in full weight, b'mishkalu here. And the only other time we hear about weight was in 24:22, the weight of the jewelry that Abraham's servant provided to Rachel to show how serious he was, in order to be able to get Laban to give Rachel to come out. And notice how parallel it is with Laban as Joseph and Rachel as Simeon, or perhaps as Benjamin, her own child after all, trying to be released from Egypt by buying her back in a certain way. So they haven't done that yet, but this is their witness to the money that they tried to buy the grain with was given back to them. And now they're trying to return it. Literally, we've returned it in our hands. And again, the emphasis on the return issue. So let's go down a little further and see some more of our scene. "Moreover, we have brought down with us," or literally in our hands two times there, as you can hear, "additional money to buy food." And if we follow it over here, we can see that. "Additional silver to buy food. We do not know who put the silver in our sacks." And that's certainly the truth. From their perspective, they can't imagine how that happened. If we were to look at our where is God in the story aspect, as we can see here, they had thought God had done it when they found the money back in chapter 28. But here, when the steward replies, "Rest assured, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father must have put treasure in your sacks." So when they heard it back in 42:28, they thought God had done it as some kind of punishment to them to get them in trouble, perhaps recalling that they'd sold Joseph and made the 20 pieces of silver there, although they didn't make that particular connection. And now it's being presented by Joseph's man as if it was a great gift to them. Is that the perspective? Let's continue to look and see. So he says, rest assured, or literally shalom lechem here, peace be with you. And I translated that just as shalom here because we'll see in the next video when they actually encounter Joseph, shalom will come up 3 times in the exchange. Shalom being the Hebrew word for not only peace and greeting, but for fullness of harmony of humans and society and of the earth. So shalom be with you. Do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father must have put treasure in your sacks. I received your silver. And so what about Joseph's plan? If we'd assumed with the brothers that Joseph was doing that to make them feel guilty and afraid, and he was punishing them, why is he having his servant tell them this theological explanation that God was at work here? And we don't hear about it again in the rest of the chapter. When he sends them back, he'll send his silver cup with them, and then we'll hear a different response when they find the silver cup and return with it. But for now, it seems to belie the idea that Joseph is trying to punish them by putting the silver there, but instead trying to suggest that God is caring for them. Let's look a little more closely at what Joseph's servant says. Is he talking about 2 different gods here, or the same God in 2 different ways? Your God and the God of your father. We see a regular attribution of the God singular of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob throughout the Hebrew Bible, but there the word for God, whether as Elohim or as Yahweh, is singular. But here there's 2 references. As White notes below, the official knows that Joseph and not God is responsible for this action. His response thus deliberately plays upon the popular tendency to see in the uncanny the action of the divine. But in so doing, he offers yet another example in this narrative of the correlation of the role of Joseph with the role of God. Here, however, it is done with conscious intent by one of the characters to deceive another. In other words, he well knows that this isn't God. He knows that this is something that Joseph has told him to say, even though he knows that Joseph did it. Might he attribute that Joseph did it and that was God working through him? Well, we can't imagine what this Egyptian servant thinks about the God of Israel leading an Egyptian vizier to do something to Canaanites. But it does seem to suggest multiple gods here. Your God as one God and the God of your father, suggesting that's double there. The phrase God of your father we've heard a couple of times before, and we'll hear it a couple of times more, and we'll hear it a couple of key times in Exodus, precisely in the burning bush story, the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob there. Although we'll see father now 14 times from here up to the reconciliation. But interestingly, what does Joseph's servant know about these brothers' father? He doesn't know anything about them. We know that Joseph is asking about their father, but he doesn't know anything about it. Maybe it's just a generic sense they must have a father, and that father must have a God, but we don't know anything more about that. And he says, must have put treasure, matamon, literally hidden treasure, only a few other times in the Hebrew Bible, only here in Genesis or the entire Torah, must have put hidden treasure in your sacks for you. In other words, receive it as a gift. And not only that, he brought Simeon out to them. They might have even forgot about Simeon, and we might have too. It seemed when they were home, nobody mentioned Simeon by name. They mentioned that he was there. As Turner notes below, the release of Simeon prior to the display of Benjamin underscores that this was a ruse simply to get Benjamin to Joseph. Do they know that Joseph has seen Benjamin? We don't know that. So let's scroll down just a little more to finish our scene here. So, as my note on verse 24 has, note the details of the hospitality. It is from their perspective as they slowly come to see how different this reception is from the previous one. It is a precise refutation of their fears expressed in verse 18, including the donkeys, which is part of what makes it such a nice, tight chiasm. But there's more. When the steward brought the men into, or just the man, into Joseph's house and had given them water, and they had washed their feet and had given their donkeys fodder, and we might know how closely that parallels this verse 24:32, when the man, which is to say Abraham's servant, came into the house, Laban's house, and Laban unloaded the camels and gave him straw and fodder for the camels and water to wash his feet and the feet of the men with them. And that's exactly when the servant gives Rachel the jewelry that echoed with the weight of the silver earlier in our scene. So that will be setting up what we'll see in chapter 44 of the pursuit of the brothers with the silver goblet, paralleling Laban's pursuit with the teraphim, and back in that story. So here, those echoes, also washing the feet echoes in 18:4 and 19:2, when Abraham and Sarah invited the visitors to wash their feet, as well as what Lot offered the same visitors to do when they came to Sodom. So all those hospitality scenes coming to mind. And given their donkeys fodder, reminding us of the fact that when they fed them the fodder at the resting place, that's when they found the silver. And they made the present, the minha, that we recalled in the last video was parallel to what Jacob tried to provide, or did provide to Esau to try to make up for his having stolen the blessing. They made the present ready for Joseph's coming at noon. And I just need to ask for a moment, what does that mean to make it ready? They had these various things, the balm, the resin, the pistachios, the almonds, etc. How are they going to make them ready? Perhaps take them out of the sack and spread them out, as one might take a bottle of wine out of the bag and put it on the table if you're a guest at somebody's house. But they do that, for they'd heard they would dine there. And notice this is apparently being reported to us in unreported speech between the servant and them, that they would hear they would dine there, which is highlighting that it isn't coming directly from Joseph. They've not said they've heard from Joseph, and Joseph doesn't have a speaking part here. So with all that element, they're just cooling their heels, waiting for Joseph to come home, and apparently not afraid now, but they must be wondering what will happen when we encounter the vizier, who they still don't know is their brother. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.